timely topic. This is it. And I was thinking this afternoon, somebody said not long ago that some of our best programs that we had started lectures for 50, 60 years, some of our best programs have been given by local speakers. I've ever since Al McLean, he was one of them. Probably some others here. Tonight we're going to have another one of our neighbors. Reginald Shareef lives right down the road here. And he wrote the only African-American history of the Roanoke Valley, African-American Heritage. But he's done a lot since then. Been teaching at Radford University for 30 years and also at Radford and Roanoke College. He's going to talk about some of the economic side of slavery. Reginald?
Thank you, George, and thank you for inviting me today. I'd also like to thank the Historical Society of Western Virginia and the Western Link Museum for sponsoring this event. One of the areas I'm interested in as an academic and written about is a field that most people have never heard of, and that's called organizational sense making. And organizational sense making attempts to give a holistic view and meaning to social phenomena. And so we think about slavery as a social phenomenon, something that happens. You have to understand that many of us, depending on our experience with slavery, bring different perspectives. And what organizational sense making does in the process is try to create a holistic perspective of slavery in this case. And I often use the example of the Sufi parable of 5 blindfolded men trying to describe an elephant. The guy that touches the leg, the guy that touches the tail, the guy that touches the trunk, the lady, right? They can only describe the part that they touched. But if you take the blindfold off, they see the entire elephant. And that's what, in one sense, I want to try to do this afternoon, is to take the metaphor, lift the metaphor blindfold off of this phenomenon that we know as slavery. And in particular, slavery in America that was known as a peculiar institution. A peculiar institution. And so I'm going to first define that concept, and then I'm going to look at the slavery phenomenon from an economic, social psychology, and value relative perspective. Now, I'm going to apologize at the beginning because I'm going to end up reading somewhat long passages to try to amplify the points I make. So I apologize for that. I'm also a professor, and I'm not used to lecturing. I'm used to sort of throwing out an idea, and the students respond, and we have this give and take. If I do that, we'll be here at 9:30. So what I'm going to do is I've got a pretty extensive outline that covers these 4 areas I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to go through the outline, and I'm going to resist the temptation to try to explain concepts as I go through, so that we can have time at the end for question and answer. I'd really like for you to ask questions, and because some of the concepts and some of the ways I'm framing this discussion is going to be very different from what we've socially learned about slavery in the United States, and slavery in a global sense, from a world view. I also have this outline. I've got business cards with me, so after the presentation, if you would like to have a copy of the outline, and I have an annotated bibliography, the citations I use, I'll give you a card, and I'll be more than willing to send you a copy of this. So the title of the presentation is Slavery as America's Peculiar Institution, an Economic, Social Psychology, and Value Relative Analysis. And one of the things in organizational sense making we try to do is to try to establish a shared reality. So we launch off from some agreed upon positions. And so one is that slavery remains one of the oldest and most widespread institutions on earth. So slavery was not unique to America. All right, so prostitution is the world's oldest profession, slavery is right behind it. So there's nothing in that sense unique about the importation of Africans to the United States. in the form of slavery. Slavery has been around and continues to be around. Second, the English word slave is derived from Slavs, from the Slavic people that were enslaved by the Ottoman Turks and Muslims, and also by Western European Christians. And they were so enslaved, and they were enslaved for so many years, so many decades, that the English word, and also the Arabic word, is derived from Slavs. And so if there was a slave race, right, or a race that carries the designation of being enslaved for centuries and centuries, it's the European Slavic group. And third, enslaved people, whether they were enslaved based on race or religion, might be despised or held in contempt after they were enslaved, but their race or religion was not the catalyst for the enslavement. So in other words, slavery occurred, and then there had to be a justification for the slavery. And in the United States, what happened, the racial hate that followed the enslavement of African people was based on the notions of inherent or innate or genetic black inferiority. And that carries on to today because it's been taught, it's embedded in the culture. And the African slaves were enslaved and brought to the United States solely for economic reasons. Solely for economic reasons. So those are the three bases or premises, foundations I'd like to lay out for us to agree upon. And now we'll start with what made American slavery a peculiar institution. Now conservatives make the argument that American slavery was peculiar only because it was at odds with the founding principles of this country. Thomas Sowell, a well-known black economist, says that slavery was peculiar only because human bondage was inconsistent with the principles of American democracy, especially liberty and property. And Newt Gingrich, writing recently in the New York Times in a rebuttal of the 1619 Project that the Times is carrying, wrote, clearly, if you are African American, slavery is what you see at the center of the American experience. But for most Americans, most of the time, there are a lot of other things going on. There were several 100,000 white Americans who died in the Civil War to free the slaves. And that's true. That's true. And that's one part of that elephant that the conservatives attention. This worldview sees slavery as essentially an issue of liberty, and the issue of societal freedom for blacks was fundamentally settled in 1865. And if not in 1865, certainly in 1868, with the three post-Civil War amendments, especially the 14th Amendment, that says you cannot deny a person life, liberty, or property without due process. So no longer were African American people property. And the Equal Protection Clause. So for conservatives, the issue really stops in 1868. After that, everybody was equal, because you were free, right? And you had due process rights. However, liberals like the late Harvard sociology professor and U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan have a more expansive view of the peculiarity of American slavery. And so Moynihan wrote, American slavery was profoundly different from, and its lasting effect on individuals and their children, indescribably worse than any recorded servitude, ancient or modern. And so what Moynihan did was to compare slavery in Brazil, which also imported a number of African Americans, with slavery in the United States. And this is what he said. The feudal Catholic society of Brazil had a legal and religious tradition that offered a slave a place, a miserable place to be sure, as a human being in society. A slave could legally marry. He could be baptized and become a member of the Catholic Church. His family could not be broken up for sale. He had days to rest or earn money to buy his freedom. And then he contrasted that with American slavery. And he said nothing in English law or Protestant theology accommodated the fact of human bondage. Slaves were reduced to the status of chattel property, just like this text, less than human beings. Slaves were totally removed from the protection of organized society. Their existence as a human being had no recognition by any religious or secular law. And in my notes I have here, see, for example, the 1857 Dred Scott case. Children could be sold, marriages were not recognized, and a man's wife could be violated or sold. Slaves could be subjected without redress to barbaric punishment. Even if the master, an American slave, wanted to free his slaves, every legal obstacle was used to prevent that action. In concluding, Moynihan said, "This is not what slavery meant in the ancient world, in medieval and early Europe, or Brazil, or the West Indies." So, Moynihan touches another part of that element. Conservatives and liberals argue about this fact all the time. While I agree with both Sowell and Moynihan's analysis concerning the peculiarities of American slavery, they both ignore the most salient independent variable that made American slavery peculiar. Since the legitimacy for Western European Christians to enslave the pagans of the Balkans and Eastern Europe was no longer tenable, a new justification for slavery was needed at the time of the importation of slaves in America. What made slavery unique, what made American slavery unique, was the religious and legal justification of genetic, black, intellectual, and moral inferiority. It was genetic. This is what the ideology says. It was genetic. It was immutable. You couldn't change it. As one writer in the recent New York Times 1619 project noted, white Americans, whether invested in slavery or not, had a considerable psychological as well as economic investment in the doctrine of black inferiority. While liberty was the inalienable right of the people who would be considered white, enslavement and subjugation became the natural station of people who had any discernible drop of black. So that's what made American slavery. It was the first time in human history that people who had been enslaved, right, a doctrine developed to justify the enslavement, reduced the human being to subject. Now, the framers of the Constitution were not the first to believe, based on natural law, that people came in two types, slaves and non-slaves. They inherited these justifications for slavery from the Greeks. Aristotle was the first to articulate that slaves were born A, without souls, and B, the ability to think, so they needed masters to tell them what to do. Furthermore, Aristotle thought that slaves were living tools fit only for physical labor. And these ideas became part of the ideology that defined black genetic inferiority. Plato likewise thought it was for the better to rule over the inferior based on slave and non-slave status. The U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the Dred Scott case in 1857 enshrined this thinking into law and culture. That ruling said that black people, whether enslaved or free, came from a slave race. This made them inherently inferior to white people and therefore incompatible with American democracy. Democracy was for white citizens, and the Negro race was a separate class of persons which the founders had not regarded as a portion of the people or citizens of the government, and had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This belief that black people were a slave race became the root of endemic racism that this country still suffers from. If black people could never be citizens, if they were cast apart from other humans, then they did not require the rights bestowed by the Constitution. Thus, America, while an economic class with upward social mobility, and I'm living proof that America has upward social mobility. It is also a sociological racial caste based on the ideology of genetic black inferiority. These socially constructed ideas are deeply embedded in both the national and global culture. This social construction shapes how blacks and other groups make sense of African Americans. Both conservatives like Sowell and liberals like Moynihan have a psychological blind spot in acknowledging that while America is a class system, it is simultaneously a racial caste system. However, black thinkers, going back to W.E.B. Du Bois, have always viewed America as a racial caste, and led to the development of critical race theory, which is now taught in law schools and schools of public policy. My son finished W&L Law School in 2006, and I was surprised that they taught a course in critical race theory then, because a lot of law now or a lot of legal thinking at least, is based on the notion that America is a racial caste. So when we think about a racial caste, think about what women talk about as the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling, there's only so far you can progress in America. This social construction of reality concerning genetic black inferiority, and thus that the group deserves to be at the very bottom of the racial caste, is not conditional. It is inheritable and immutable. It is inheritable. You come with the skin, then you got a place in the society. Now, we're not always conscious of it. So we talk about overt racism and institutional racism. So we're not talking about overt racism. We're talking about a process of 300, 400, 500, 600 years of social learning. Hence, from this view, since President Obama really was often the smartest guy in the room, the vicious libel from President Trump against Obama that he was not born in the United States should not have been unexpected. And moreover, that people believed it should not have been unexpected. So the peculiarities of American slavery still shape how we make sense of each other. Part 2, the economics of American slavery. Before the abolishment of the international slave trade was ended in the British Parliament in 1807, 400,000 enslaved Africans were sold in the United States. We're all familiar with the African slaves picking cotton in the South to enrich the Southern plantation owners. Yet the North, especially New York City, also benefited economically from this free labor. The relentless buying, finance, selling, and insuring of black bodies, and the products of their labor made Wall Street a thriving banking, insurance, and trading sector, and 2, New York City, the financial capital of the world. Remember, once we as a group were reduced to property, there was insurance on us. If people bought us, they bought insurance. There was all kinds of trading, right? The Buttonwood Agreement of 1792 later became the New York Stock Exchange and covered transactions and companies involved in the slave trade, including the purchase of slaves on credit, shipping, and insurance of slaves. Here's some of the men that made a lot of money, northern men. And it's really important because later we're going to see there were the North financed the slave trade. The plantations were in the South. John Jacob Astor, America's first millionaire, made his fortune in furs, China trade, and the slave trade. Astor, who died in 1848, is the namesake for the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. Moses Taylor's banking operations helped finance the illegal slave trade and evolved into the giant bank, Citibank. Philip Livingston, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, used his slave-based wealth to endow Yale University's first professorship. He was also a founder of King's College, which later became Columbia University. Charles Tiffany got financing from his father, who owned a cotton mill in Connecticut that processed cotton picked by slave labor, to open a fancy goods store in 1837 in New York City. Thus, slave profits were instrumental in launching Tiffany & Company, the world-renowned jewelry store. In sum, the slave trade was economically profitable for both those in the North and those in the South. So how did the framers respond to calls from London once they were free, or in the process of gaining independence, to end the slave trade? By 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over the role in this peculiar and barbaric institution. As we have seen, these calls for ending the slave trade would have upended the economies of both the North and the South. Conveniently left out of America's founding mythology is the fact that one of the primary reasons the colonists sought independence from Great Britain was over the slave issue. So we think Boston Tea Party. But another part of the reason the people fought for independence from Great Britain was because Great Britain was in the process. It took 50 years, it didn't occur in 1807, but ended the international slave trade. The wealth and prominence that allowed Jefferson in 33 and other founding fathers to believe they could break off from the mighty British Empire came from the astronomical profits generated by chattel products. 10 of America's first 12 presidents were slave owners. Ironically, in making the argument against British tyranny, one of the colonists' favorite rhetorical devices was to claim that they were slaves to Britain. So this is an argument that Jefferson, Washington, Madison made to the British, that we're slaves of the British crown. For this duplicity, they faced intense criticism, both at home and abroad, as evidenced by Samuel Johnson, a British Tory opposed to independence. And Johnson said, "How is it that we hear the yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" And when I started my work on my PhD in public administration and policy in 1980, nearly 40 years ago, we had to read a book by a political economist named Charles Beard. And this book was written in 1913 and it's called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And Beard argued that the structure of the Constitution was primarily shaped by the economic interests of the founders. Now, again, I want to reinforce this book was written in 1913. He contended that the Constitution was a counter-revolution between northern bankers and merchants, those who financed the slave trade, and southern farmers and plantation owners. The Constitution protected the economic interests of both the banking and merchant class and the plantation owner by the following: protecting the property of those who enslaved black people, prohibited the federal government from ending the importation of enslaved Africans for 20 years. It allowed Congress to mobilize the militia to put down insurrection by the enslaved and forced states that had outlawed slavery to turn over enslaved people who had escaped, the famous fugitive slave laws. In 1800, plantation owners overthrew the capitalists in the North by electing Thomas Jefferson as president, thus establishing Jeffersonian democracy. However, both northern bankers and merchants and southern plantation owners continued to profit from the free labor of black bodies. So what did Adam Smith, the founder of modern capitalism, think about natural law justifications that Aristotle and Plato had articulated, justifying slavery? Smith wrote 2 books, The Wealth of Nations, that most of us are familiar with, but he also wrote another book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he talked about the subject of slavery in both. He sought to refute the linkage between natural law and slavery. He believed that tyranny, not economic utility, was the basis of slavery. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that slave labor was less productive than free labor, since freemen worked for themselves and worked harder. He also said that slavery reduces productivity because slaves had no incentive to improve productivity, and that slavery had hampered economic growth throughout history. In his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he said, there are only 2 groups of people that like slavery: aristocrats and wealthy merchants. Southern aristocrats like Jefferson, northern wealthy merchants. So there are only 2. And why? Because they feared market competition. So Adam Smith, the founder of modern capitalism, was adamantly opposed to slavery for these basic supply and demand reasons. In sum, despite natural law justifications from the Greeks, in the forthcoming establishment of Jeffersonian democracy, the 3rd president of the United States feared God's punishment for this peculiar institution that he benefited from, as he wrote in 1784 in the notes on Virginia. This is a rather long quote, but very profound. And this is what Jefferson said. And the liberties of a nation can be secure when we have removed it. And can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Thus, considering numbers in nature, and nature's means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is possible among possible events, that it may become probable through supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute that can take side with us in such a contest. Like the Jewish tribes with Moses, Jefferson made the conscious choice to worship the prophets derived from the golden calf of the peculiar institution, rather than heed God's warning against the inhuman man-made system of child. And he knew. He feared God's punishment individually and on American society for participation in peculiar institution. Part 3, the social psychology of the peculiar institution, contemporary implications. And so I used the work here of Claude Steele. And Claude Steele is a social psychologist at Stanford University. He wrote an article in 1995 that, when I looked it up yesterday, it has 9,000 citations. Now, as a person that does research and has published in journals, I find it absolutely amazing that any one article could have 9,000 citations. But Steele and his co-authors articulated this concept called stereotype threat. Stereotype threat. Now, Steele wrote this in 1995, and even 20 years later, 24 years later, this article is still being cited. They're still doing workshops on this. But stereotype threat just simply says that the fear, especially in African Americans, but they've now expanded this to women, the fear of confirming a negative stereotype concerning genetic inferiority harms black students doing test taking. And so they did these experiments, and they gave comparable black and white students at Stanford University a project to do. And there was a reading section from the graduate record exam. For those of you who have gone to graduate school, sent children to graduate school, so this is the test you have to take. These are really smart kids at Stanford University, and many have been prepped on the geography. And so with one group, Steele and his colleagues told them that this was an intelligence test. And with the other group, they told them it was a problem-solving test. And what they found is the group that they told that this was an intelligence test, the black kids scored low. Because they were so afraid of reaffirming the notion, the learned behavior of black intellectual inferiority, that they didn't do well. Kids that took the test and were told it was problem solving, the outcomes were common. The second test that Steele and his group did was to give this same graduate record exam passage, but tell the kids to code it, tell one group of the students to code it based on race, and the other not to. Black kids who coded it based on race did worse than their white colleagues or classmates, but the other group of black kids did. So stereotype is really, it's real. So it's a burden, it's a learned burden. Fear reinforcing the inferiority. I want to deviate just a little, but women have now faced stereotypes because they thought that women can't do high levels of science and economics and math. And so they face stereotype threat the same way. So now these tests are being used to diagnose and teach women to overcome this fear of not doing well. In my area of leadership and organizational change, in 2013, there was a study in the Academy of Management Journal. And the goal of the research was to show how people, both black and white, viewed black leaders. And the overwhelming majority, both black and white, found that black leaders were incompetent because they were not intelligent. And even when black leaders were successful, when there was organizational success, right, the respondents did not attribute that success to intelligence, but to people, to the black leader being kind, friendly, approachable, and having compassion. So these learned behaviors are very deep, and we pass them on in the culture. Consequently, the socially constructed belief in black intellectual inferiority that began with the racist justification for the peculiar institution is so deeply embedded in world culture that despite black leadership, organizational success, respondents will attribute that success to other characteristics than intelligence. And this is both blacks, whites, Hispanics, whoever is in the group. Part 4. Peculiar institution and value relativity. Now, value relativity is something that we suffer from in American society today. Value relativity just says that there are no absolute values, that everything is situational. So throw the 10 Commandments out the window, throw all of that out. It's just relative, right? And this contrasts with universal moral values that are found in religion. These values transcend time and space. For example, I've been married 42 years. I can't go home and tell Faye Shareef that adultery just won't buy it. Its value remains. Thus, slavery was always wrong, whether practiced by the Romans against the Jewish people, the Ottoman Turks who were Muslims against Western, the Ottoman Turks who were Muslims or Western European Christians on the people of Eastern Europe, the Arab slave trade, or the American slave trade. Slavery was always wrong. It has never been a moral right. Contemporary sex trafficking of young women is a form of slavery and is morally wrong today. It was morally wrong 2,000 years ago. Some men, like young girls, and there's a trafficking of this going on in this country and around the world today. It's not right. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't right. It wasn't right 2,000 years ago. Thomas Sowell makes the value relative argument for why the peculiar institution existed and was condoned in America by the framers. This is a direct quote from Sowell's work. Those who criticize the writers of the Constitution for condoning slavery by their silence on the subject have a valid point only if its abolition was in fact an option open to them at the time. In a new country struggling for survival, a much larger and more powerful United States was shaken to its foundation by a civil war generations later. Had the U.S. split over the issue of slavery when the Constitution was written in 1787, it is no means clear that the North would have prevailed or that the country would have survived. Sowell makes a classic political Machiavellian argument. Do what's expedient. Don't worry about tomorrow. Do what's expedient. Yet Thomas Jefferson makes no such Machiavellian political argument against slavery in his notes on Virginia in 1784. So Jefferson was there. He understands the immoral social psychology of slavery and rails against it, but he also loves the economic benefits of slavery. So this is what Jefferson wrote. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submission on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the liniment of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives loose to his worst passions, and thus nurse, educated, and daily exercise in tyranny cannot be stamped by but its odious peculiarities. Jefferson was not a social psychologist, but he understood that this social learning was being learned by both whites who owned slaves and whites in general, and blacks who were slaves or even free. Yet for over 50 years, Jefferson was locked, along with the other framers, into the slave system for purely economic reasons. He simply could not afford to free his slaves because he needed them to work his 10,000 acres of land, which without their labor would have lost its value. Thus, Jefferson not only devoted himself to an economy based on slave labor, but also to the defense of the idea that the slaves themselves constituted a legitimate form of property, and slavery was an indispensable social good. In sum, Jefferson simply put economic profit over moral economics, but he was not hypocritical about the decision. There was no value relativity in his decision to profit from the slave economy. Conclusion. The foregoing discussion does not seek to make slavery of Africans by Europeans unique due to some type of moral deficiency in the West. We're all human beings. So there's no moral deficiency in Europeans or Americans who profited from the slave activity. African tribes enslaved other African tribes as a result of war. The earlier discussions of the Ottoman Turks and their enslavement of the Slavic people of Eastern Europe in the 1500s led to centuries of deeply embedded hatreds that exploded 500 years later in the deadly Bosnian War of the early 1990s and killed thousands of Muslims. That hatred for what the Ottoman Turks had done to the people who were in Yugoslavia was nurtured, and then it exploded. Tito tried to, after World War II, tried to unite Yugoslavia, Bosnians, the Croats, and the Serbs. And he did, and it lasted as long as he lived. Once Tito died, Milosevic came. He tapped into that ancient history, and then thousands of Bosnian Muslims died. The story of Arab Muslims enslaving thousands of Africans in the 14th century, like that of the Ottoman Turks, severely tarnishes the fundamental Islamic principle of egalitarianism. So slavery, for whatever reason, is not unique to Europeans, not unique to Arabs, it's not unique to any group, especially the three groups in the monotheistic tradition, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There are prohibitions against slavery in all three, and yet all three religious groups have engaged in the practice and profited economically from it. And so my presentation doesn't seek to indict whites of America, or European whites of America. Slavery. It remains an institution that should be deplored. However, the foregoing conclusion does empirically demonstrate the uniqueness of America's peculiar institution. Nowhere else has slavery existed like it did in the United States. It also demonstrates empirically how, for the first time in history, that religious and legal and educational institutions were used to justify the genetic inferiority of a race in order to condone slavery. And most importantly, in my mind, the foregoing shows how and why, in any form, slavery is always a moral wrong. Thank you. Yes, questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned at the beginning the Slavic. So has race always been a factor in slavery, or?
There is religion.
Okay.
And the Western Christians and Ottoman Turks, who were Muslims, they enslaved the people, the Slavic people, called them pagans, and really, really mistreated them. And, but by the 1760s, the British could no longer, the British Parliament was against both that type of slavery in Eastern Europe because it led to perpetual war and conflict, and the type of slavery, the peculiar institution in the United States. But no, I mean, people have been enslaved primarily through at least recent history, either based on religion or race. or the justification was given for it. There were utilitarian reasons that people were enslaved. Yes, sir.
I guess I don't quite understand how you distinguish between the view of those people who were enslaving others because of religion. I guess what you're saying, I'm trying to clarify.
Okay, sure.
That it gets institutionalized in the United States.
Well, it gets institutionalized. For example, now I'm Muslim, so in Islam, if people were captured in war, and they voluntarily converted to Islam, then they were free. At least it was supposed to be free, right? American slavery was based on the ideology of genetic inferiority. So I come with this black skin, I am inherently innate. I'm inherently inferior. I can't rise to your level intellectually, morally, or any other way. And that was the justification. And so when you talk about things being genetic and immutable, that means they can't be changed. They can't be changed. And so when you have religious slavery based on religion, if people, again, the Catholic example in Brazil that Monahan used, it still created a racial caste, but in that sense it was more humane than what existed in the United States. Yes, ma'am.
I never heard that connection between, about the Tito unifying
Yugoslavia, yeah.
And the Ottoman
Yes.
enslaving. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. Tito was a powerful leader, and after World War II, he united the various groups. You had the Catholics, they're the Croats, the Eastern Orthodox Christians, and the Bosnian Muslims. They were all there together. They lived together for 50 or 60 years, up until the mid-1980s. And then Milosevic, understanding these deep-seated resentments, began to tap into those old hatreds. And by 1990, the whole place exploded. And Bosnian Muslims, who are Europeans, and they lived in the country for years and intermarried and lived and everything, all of a sudden they were the enemy, and they bore the brunt of what the Ottoman Turks had done 500 or 600 years before. Yes, sir.
Seems to me Thomas Jefferson must have had a lot to struggle with in his mind, because these days it seems to be accepted that he had a number of children with Sally Hemings as one of his slaves.
Yes. He was just a conflicted guy.
Yeah.
But I do respect Jefferson. And let me say this, I told George this, right? I sent 2 children to the University of Virginia. Just like the guy that much, I didn't send my children there, right? They both done well professionally, so. But I think that Jefferson understood the monstrous system that he had helped create. He could see the long-term impact. He feared God was going to punish for this. But yet he loved the economic profit from free labor. And so that was his conflict. But he doesn't make a value relative argument about, he doesn't say I'm right. He says, I know I'm wrong, right? And for that I can respect. But yeah, with Sally Hemings and that type thing, yes. Yes, sir.
So, how do you, well, okay, so that was the opinion of people 400, 500 years
Right.
ago that black people were inferior.
Right.
How can you judge somebody poorly at that time if that was the belief? Now, I think we've moved on. I'm sure there's still people who believe that,
Yeah.
obviously, but
Well, I
I'm
would
trying
say,
to excuse it, but
I would say that's the value relativity argument. I would say, would Jefferson want his children subjected to what he was subjecting them to? The answer is no. I would ask Jefferson, if he had a wife, I don't know, I'd ask Madison if he wanted Dolly Madison raped and he would have said no. So the slavery was always wrong. The behavior was always wrong. There's no justifying. There's no value relativity. There's no, we look back now because we're a more evolved society. Nobody wants that done. We see, I'm not picking on President Trump, but we see President Trump caging immigrant children. We see him separating children from parents, right? That's exactly what happened in the American slave trade. And it wasn't right then, it's not right now. Or at least from Reginald Shareef's perspective. Yes, sir.
Can you recommend a book about the enslavement of the Slavs?
I can't, but I can get one to you. Because Thomas Sowell, sorry.
I can recommend, if anyone, the recent history of the Silk Road, which is a history of the world, basically from the Middle Eastern, Near Eastern perspective, by a respected scholar. And he has a whole chapter on the slave road. And he talks about exactly what you said. The Vikings, they got a great deal of their wealth from slavery. He says that Venice got its initial wealth from the slave trade. And so I recommend that. It's a fairly recent I think you can find it at Barnes & Noble. My brother gave it to me a couple years ago, but it has a whole chapter exactly what you were talking about on the history of slavery in the world.
Yeah. I mean, the Slavic people, I mean, African Americans, see, nothing's new under the sun. So once Aristotle and Plato came up with this justification for slavery, certain people were born into slave status, and they don't have a soul, they can't think. That became the rationale that the framers used. It's the same thing. And the writers, if you read some of the writings on the 1619 Project, you'll see that African Americans are known as a slave group, right? But so are the Slavic people. I mean, if the very name slave is derived from Slavic, right, then those people were really, really enslaved and brutalized and mistreated for a long time. If this black skin is immutable and I have no free will and I can't think and this black skin dictates my behavior, then for the Slavic people, they carry the same burden. And you can look at how Western European people look at Eastern European people. And they don't look at them as their equal at all. And a lot of that is rooted in this. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it proves more in the past than now that the go-to source of determining what's right and wrong is the Bible. And haven't many people used the Bible
Yes.
to justify slavery?
Absolutely.
And is there anywhere in the Bible that it condemns slavery?
Well, now, I'm not a biblical scholar. I can tell you about the Holy Quran, and I can tell you about Islam.
All right, let's go to the Quran.
Let's go to the Quran. There is nothing, there is a reward in Islam from God for freeing slaves. And there's this story in Islam. It's a very famous story. It's a story about an Ethiopian slave named Bilal. And Bilal was enslaved at the time that Prophet Muhammad was receiving revelation, and it was a small Islamic community. And Bilal heard about the teachings of Islam, the belief in one God and one creation. And his master punished him for saying that God is the creator, and you're not God, right? So they put Bilal out in the sun, put a big rock on his chest, and told him that until he said that the owner was God, that he would be there unless he died. And Bilal kept saying, Ahad, Ahad, one God, one God. And then one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad came along and purchased him, bought his freedom. And so whenever you hear the call to prayer in Islam, right, the Prophet Muhammad designated Bilal to be the first caller to prayer. It's such a high station, right? And in the prophet's last address, he said there is no superiority of the Arab over the non-Arab, the white over the non-white. The only thing that reaches God is your righteousness. Now, that's pretty clear. It doesn't mean all Muslims do it. But it's pretty easy to call them out when they don't do it. Right? They have no justification. So, but I can't speak about the Bible. I mean, the little I know that, I think that white supremacists look at the story of Ham in the Bible, and dark people, black people would be the hewers of wood, the carriers of water, whatever. They find some justification there. I can't speak on it, but I think as a Christian principle, that slavery would not condone being Christian.
We have teachings like in Christ there is neither slave nor free. That kind of.
But the Old Testament is different.
But the story of Moses appears in the Old Testament, right? And yeah, set the people free. I think human beings have free will. Human beings do what they want to do. Religious teachings, moral teachings guide us, right? But then we're tested on those beliefs. And that's why I use the analogy of Jefferson with the Jewish tribes that were with Moses. Because when Moses, whether the story is actual or allegorical, went up on the mountain to get the commandments, the Jewish people that he had led to freedom said, we don't know about that God up on that mountain that Moses is talking to, but we know about this goal. And I think that's an analogy for people who abandon religious beliefs and worship monetary benefits and materialism. Yes.
I just want to say one thing, I hope, about Thomas Jefferson.
Okay.
To go back to your statement about being trapped economically in that whole cycle of slavery. The Virginia legislature, if you freed a slave, you had to pay the government to free your slave. You couldn't just let him go.
Right.
You had to. So, however we couch the way we want an institution to exist, you know, supposedly that was because the people who were untrained were not property holders themselves, could not purchase property and make a living for themselves. You paid that fine to the government because the government was going to take care of them. That was how it was couched. But it really meant we don't want you out there in society competing. But Thomas Jefferson, because when he wrote his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, it called for freeing all people, because I think in his heart of hearts, he wanted that to happen, conflicted as he was.
Yes.
But Benjamin Franklin said, we have to be united against England, which means all 13 colonies. 3 colonies would not accept that, so it was redrafted. And that particular language that did say Negro in it was deleted. So Thomas Jefferson had made an effort. Now, what happened, because it was not accepted by the group of representatives from the 13 colonies, then that made Virginia forcing you to pay to free your own state. It made that okie dokie, you know. So it was just caught in that whole cycle where our government said, we're going to oppress even the people who want to grant freedom. And that was, Thomas Jefferson couldn't afford on 2 levels to free his slaves. He had the income coming in, but he also couldn't afford to pay the Virginia government to free them either. So he was trapped in a way. Poor old Tom. That's all. That was my thought. Just poor old Tom.
I'll leave poor old Thomas. I believe human beings always have choice were made. Soil says that, and along the lines that you're talking about, that there were no options. There are always options. May not be options that we want to make. And that's always the challenge that human beings have. But there were options. Again, at least from my perspective. But I respect and understand what you're saying. Yes.
A few months ago, I read the book, The Color of Law, which for me was a real eye-opener in terms of ways that our government has continued to try to keep us segregated.
Well, I think this is just deeply learned behavior. I don't like to and that's why I ended this in the conclusion by saying that there's no genetic deficiency in whites in America, right? I mean, but our social condition, and that's why I find organizational sense making so interesting, because it requires you to not just look at social phenomena from, as Jane mentioned, from your comfort level, but from a different comfort level, right? Because what we want to do is create a holistic understanding. And this social conditioning, still studies out there. Those black kids are really, and black people in general, are really concerned about reinforcing notions of intellectual inferiority, right? And so that's something that we carry unless we work on it. I see Miss Stephanie Moon over here. And she is the, what for the city of Roanoke?
City clerk.
City clerk, right? Now, I met Stephanie when she was about 15 years old. I was driving a bus. She was just in high school. She was going out to OIC. And Stephanie's really done well. And I've never talked to Stephanie about this, but I know as she rolls up through the levels of city government, she often had anxiety, both for being a woman and for being black. And people looked at her competence. And any deviation, anything that went wrong, there was a question whether she was competent for the job. Now I know this. She's over there doing this, so I know I'm right, but we've never talked about it. I mean, it's a shared experience. It's a shared experience. And so I think it's something you have to get beyond as a group and as an individual, right? And so once you do that, and you're not fearful of making mistakes, fearful of someone saying you made a mistake because you just don't have the intellectual capability, then you can make progress in American society. But if you carry that baggage, that emotional, psychological baggage, you restrict your own upward social mobility in American society. Yes.
I think the same thing goes for stigmatizing any group.
Yes. I agree. I just think the depth and the longevity of the racial stereotype, right, it is so endemic. I used the word in the presentation. It's endemic racism, endemic discrimination. And when I was growing up, my mother used to tell me, she said, Reggie, you have to be twice as good. And that did not work for me. It did not work for me. I wasn't going to be twice as good. I wasn't going to have to do twice as much as anybody else. Until a friend of mine, best friend, came back from Vietnam. I don't know where but he said, but he knew I was limiting my own potential. And he told me, he said, Reggie, you know what? He said, if you do twice as much, you'll be twice as good. And it was like, and that was, he must, and he and I converted to Islam at the same time. He must have learned that because it's true. And all of a sudden, I didn't mind doing twice as much. Because, I'll humbly say, with many of my colleagues, I'm twice as good. That's the reward from God. I published, I'll give you an example. I'm a public intellectual. I published, I saw with George had a column in the Roanoke Times. I published 350 columns for the Roanoke Times, public advanced columns. It's at least that, maybe close to 400. But also published in academic journals. I write books. Often my colleagues ask me, Reggie, how did you do all this, right? And I just laugh to myself and think, I did do twice as much. I'm twice as good. So there's a reward, but it has to be framed. You have to get to the point where this is not a burden. It's almost an incentive to do. It's very, very difficult.
Any more questions? Thank you so much.